Okay guys, I promise this won't last a whole 15 minutes. I'll try to be quick, but we need to find out how did these countries, how did Germany and France and Great Britain and the United States, how do they handle this horrible economic situation? So away we go. When President Wilson had fought to make the world safe for democracy in 1919, he thought that things were going to get better in Europe. Okay? In a number of states, women could now vote. Male political leaders had rewarded women for their contributions in the war effort by granting them voting rights. There were exceptions in Italy, Switzerland, France, and Spain where women weren't going to gain the right to vote until World War II, but many countries had made gains and had created democratic governments. However, 4 years of war and 4 years of post-war turmoil and that economic situation that we just talked about are going to make it really tough for those new democratic countries to survive, or those new governments to survive. So in Germany, the Imperial Germany of William II, he's over here, Kaiser Wilhelm, had come to an end in 1918 when Germany was defeated in the war. Tomorrow they're going to talk a little bit more about Kaiser Wilhelm, and remember his abdication. He gets sent to Holland, where he spends 23 years before he dies. But anyway, he's out of Germany. So what happens next? Germany now creates a new government called the Weimar Republic. It was a democratic state, but it was plagued by problems. For one thing, the Republic had no truly outstanding political leaders. In 1925, a guy named Paul von Hindenburg, who was a World War I military hero, is going to be elected president of the Weimar Republic. But he's 77 years old. He's a really traditional military man, and he doesn't really agree with the Weimar Republic. He doesn't agree with everything that they stand for. Tomorrow, you're going to hear more about that. Anyway, the Weimar Republic also suffered from serious economic problems. It was just a bad coincidence that they're created just as this economic situation goes all downhill, and of course they get blamed for it. So they lack leadership, people that really believe in it, like Paul von Hindenburg that we just talked about. But also they were experiencing runaway inflation. You just watched a video and you saw how bad it was, but it's economic chaos. There are a lot of people in German society, like widows and teachers and civil servants, other people who had lived on a fixed income, that now, their monthly incomes were worthless. Their life savings had disappeared. Their losses were just pushing the middle class toward political parties that were more extreme, anybody who could, fix this issue. To make matters worse, after a period of relative prosperity, Germany was struck by that really bad Great Depression. In 1930, unemployment had reached 3 million people, and by March, 4.38 million people. And so the Depression was just paving the way for really extremist leaders to come to power. In France, after the defeat of Germany, France had actually, ended up in a pretty good situation. They became the stronger power on the European continent. But it really needed to rebuild itself as a nation, and that's expensive. France suffered financial problems after the war, but it had a more balanced economy than some of the other nations. It didn't begin to feel the full effects of the Great Depression until 1932, which is a little bit later than some of the other countries. The economic instability that it suffered then had political effects. So, for example, because people kept blaming the government for the economic troubles that it was in, France kept shifting gears. They had 6 different cabinets in about a span of a year and a half. In 1932 and 1933, 6 different cabinets, and a cabinet is really the team of advisors that advises a president, and really they have a lot of say-so over what happens in a country, and in some cases they as a group were actually more powerful than the leader. And so, finally, with all that chaos going on, in June of 1936, a coalition of groups, they're called leftist parties, and they're made up of communists and socialists and other radicals, formed something called the Popular Front. I'm not going to spell that all out, but the Popular Front in France gets created, the Popular Front. The Popular Front starts a program for workers that some have called the French New Deal. Now, the New Deal will sound familiar once you take U.S. history because Franklin D. Roosevelt proposes a New Deal in the United States, and France creates a New Deal like the one that is becoming popular in the U.S. So the Popular Front has a New Deal. The French New Deal gave workers the right to bargain, to create unions to negotiate for better wages and better hours, for a 40-hour work week, a 2-week paid vacation, a minimum wage, all kinds of things to try to get money back in the hands of the middle class. The Popular Front's policies, however, failed to solve the problems of the Depression. The problem is that during an economic depression might not be the best time to kind of demand more money because maybe there's no money to provide. And so, in effect, even though the sentiment might have been in the right spot, by 1938, the French had little confidence in their new political system and it failed. Now, we'd already talked about this before I left, but during the war, Britain had lost many of its markets for industrial production to the United States and Japan. Industries like coal and steel and textiles declined after the war, leading to a rise of unemployment. In 1929, 2 million Brits were out of work. Britain soon rebounded, however, and experienced a little bit of prosperity between 1925 and 1929, but then the economic depression hit. By 1929, Britain faced the growing effects of the Great Depression. They had something called the Labour Party. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but sometimes in like British sources, something that we would spell just O-R, they had an extra U. So in Great Britain at this point, they had something called the Labour Party. Okay? The Labour Party, which had become the largest party in Britain, but it failed to solve the nation's economic problems and fell from power in 1931. A new government led by the Conservatives claimed credit for bringing Britain out of the worst stages of the Depression. It did so by using traditional policies of balanced budgets and protective tariffs. Political leaders in Britain, though, largely ignored the new ideas of a British economist named John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes is going to play a pretty big, important role in the United States later on because we are not going to ignore John Maynard Keynes. In fact, even JFK, John F. Kennedy, is going to be a Keynesian as far as economics are concerned. Anyway, what John Maynard Keynes said was that sometimes you've got to spend your way, and I know this is going to sound a little funky, but you spend your way out of a depression. So by the government spending money, it stimulates factories to produce. And when factories produce, it puts money back in the hands of the people. And then when people have money, they start buying products. And so slowly but surely, the fact that the government spent this initial chunk of money in the first place stimulates the economy and get things rolling again. Eventually, the government stops spending that money and can get itself back into the black, back into balance. But in the meantime, deficit means that you're kind of going into debt to spend that initial money so that your country's economy can recover. And it actually has worked for the United States in the past. So his bottom line is, this is John Maynard Keynes right here. He says that sometimes in these sort of situations that the government ought to put people back to work by building highways and public buildings, and they should finance such projects even if they have to borrow to do it, even if they have to go into debt to do it, because putting people back to work stimulates the economy. He's especially a fan of building roads and bridges, because he says that if you're going to spend money as a government anyway, you might as well build infrastructure that's actually going to help you with trade and business in the future. So that's John Maynard Keynes, and someday when you get to college, you'll probably hear about him again because he's considered a really brilliant economic philosopher. Okay, last piece, almost done. Democratic states after the war in the United States. After Germany, no Western nation was more affected by the Great Depression than the United States. In 1932, United States industrial production had fallen 50% from its 1929 levels. By 1933, there were 15 million people unemployed. Under these circumstances, the Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt was able to win a landslide victory in 1932. A believer in free enterprise, Roosevelt realized that capitalism had to be reformed if it was to be saved. So he pursued a policy of active government intervention in the economy that came to be known as the New Deal. So Roosevelt is going to become a Keynesian. The New Deal would include an increased program of public works, including things like the Work Progress Administration. The WPA, established in 1935, was a government organization that employed between 2 to 3 million people. They worked at building bridges, roads, post offices, and airports. So you can see pretty quickly how, how Keynesian economics, how he was playing right into that. The Roosevelt administration was also responsible for new social legislation that began the U.S. welfare system. They provided in 1935 the Social Security Act, which arguably is the piece of legislation that has the largest impact on the most people in U.S. history because of the number of seniors that it serves, from that point forward. The New Deal provided reforms that perhaps prevented a social revolution in the United States. However, it didn't solve all of the unemployment problems of the Depression. In 1938, American unemployment still stood at 11 million people. World War II and the growth of weapons industries brought the United States back to full unemployment. In addition to the Works Progress Administration that we just talked about, Franklin D. Roosevelt was responsible for what they called alphabet agencies. You can see at the bottom here, alphabet agencies, and they called them that because just about every letter of the alphabet got used. The AAA stood for the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and it created a whole government agency that helped farms. There was a PWA, a Public Works Authority, that did all sorts of works with building hospitals and schools and roads and things like that. We already talked about the WPA, which is over here. He also created the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. It built dams in 7 states in the southeast part of the United States. There was also something called the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and actually some of the parks in the local area actually used CCC labor to build the trails and things like that. So for example, at Rainbow Falls Park, the CCC, actually on Seminary Hill, I think too, if you look at the signs, the CCC helped create that. I think even at Schaefer Park, so lots of parks in your local neighborhood have been used these CCC people as construction workers. Kind of interestingly, in 30 seconds or less, the CCC only hired guys and sent them out into the wilderness to blaze these trails. And they had to send the majority of their paycheck back home. And one of the ideas around the CCC is they put young men to work, but also took them away from the girls. So guess what happened to the birth rate in America? It went down because the guys were out camping and there weren't any girls there. So you couldn't reproduce, which meant the number of babies born went down, and that helped with the economy too, because if you don't have any money, maybe you shouldn't be having babies. Okay. So when the American economy collapses, the United States doesn't have the money to loan those other countries to get them out of debt, to help them pay their debts back. It wanted to do that because, it needed those nations to pay it back. But as a result of running out of money, nations stopped buying products, which caused this whole kind of slowing of the global economic system. And as soon as countries' economies slow, industry's slow. And when industry's slow, unemployment becomes a problem. This should probably say unemployment becomes a problem. Thank you.